Yeah, I got a question for you. Does a replica Super Bowl ring count as an engagement ring? Because if it doesn't, it probably should, and it's something for all of us to realistically ponder probably, come next March. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Lombardi Time Brews, where I'm your host, John Delray. No new episodes next week, so I decided let's leave off on this note of what are the lingering questions about the Green Bay Packers? What is it that, in spite of the changes this offseason and remaining consistent in a number of different areas, what are the things that just haven't been answered yet? And there are some fairly obvious ones, right? Some things that I'm just not really going to talk about because, let's just say like Jordan Love massively regresses and is awful. Well, that's the season's tank. That's the answer to that, right? Or what overall does the defense look like? We've talked about that a bit before, and there's certainly some indications, but ultimately, there's a fair amount of guesswork there. I know I'm dealing with some of these are just genuine questions that there really aren't answers to, but there are some things that we can dive into, look at some indicators, maybe some things that we didn't realize in learning about last year, and then apply towards the future and arrive at basically a question like, is Rich Bisaccia going to do anything to improve the Packers special teams this coming year? So that's, teaser, going to be one of the main questions here. So we're going to go through all of these questions. Before we get to that, though, just keep in mind one thing from me, and that is no new episodes for LTB next week. That includes no live, no nothing. It's a week off before the training camp push begins. And if you're wondering about the programming that's going to happen right after I get back, yes, of course, lives will resume, but one of the things that I'm going to cover in that week before I get back is reasons that the Packers are going to win the Super Bowl, but then also reasons why the Packers might not win the Super Bowl. And then I'm also going to do a 5-day series like I've done every year thus far, covering a fact about every single one of the Packers players on their 91-man roster as a training camp primer to project us right into camp. Because yes, indeed, folks, we are that close. It's finally here. And keep in mind, too, training camp, I've been talking about it, but I really want you to know, training camp, I'm going to be going to darn near every single practice and going to be going live after to answer all of your questions. So let's enjoy camp together this year, shall we? So let's hit the questions. And I do say, question number 1. What are the new NFL kickoff rules and how is that going to impact the Green Bay Packers? So I actually had to do a little bit of diving into this myself. We've talked about it in lives, like what are these new rules? So I went out, found this video. It came from CBS Sports. It's about a minute long, at least this portion of it. Just kind of a quick little refresher as to what the kickoff rules are going to be. Then we're going to talk about how it may impact the Green Bay Packers.
Here's everything you need to know about the NFL's new kickoff rule. It's going to look a lot like the XFL's kickoff rule. The kicker's going to be at the 35, but the kickoff team is going to start on the other 40-yard line, only 5 yards away from the blockers. These guys won't be able to move until the ball is touched by the returner. Now, the end zone to the 20-yard line will be known as the landing zone, and this is where the returner or returners will set up. If the ball is caught in this zone, it must be returned. There are no more fair catches. Remember, this rule is to encourage returns. The return rate last year was only 22%, so to incentivize that, touchbacks are much harsher to the kicking team. So let's break that down. If the kick doesn't reach the landing zone, the ball's placed at the 40-yard line. If it goes out of the end zone or flies into the end zone and is downed like a normal touchback, the ball will be placed at the 35. If it hits in the landing zone and then rolls into the end zone and is downed, the ball will be placed at the 20. But again, this is all to incentivize them kicking it into the landing zone. And if it's caught in the landing zone, it must be returned. Now, what about onside kicks? Well, the actual kick will look the exact same. The only difference is the team has to declare it to the referee, who will then notify the receiving team, which means there's no more surprise onside kicks. So, do you think this rule...
Yeah, so there you go. That's basically the summary. Now we've got a landing zone. We've got kicks that must be returned. And you hear in there that it's because returns only occurred last year in 22% of kickoffs. However, here's the relevant things for the Green Bay Packers, because that was not the case for the Green Bay Packers. In fact, Anders Carlson, now this is, of course, assuming that he gets the job again this year. If Greg Joseph wins it, of course, the numbers change. But let's just take a look at Anders. Last year, 47.5% of his kickoffs wound up being returned. That was the most in the NFL. 23.9 yards per return was the average there. That wound up being the 9th worst in the NFL. Now, of course, that doesn't all have to do with the kicker, but it certainly applies to special teams. His 3.92 hang time on kickoffs was 26th in the NFL. So, I mean, like, the Packers were not exactly excellent at kicking off last year, but here's the thing. A lot of teams are quite terrified about all the number of returns that's going to be happening at them this year. Teams can no longer just kick it off the back. That 22% thing is going to change this year, but the Packers are already incredibly used to that. They already did 16 or had 16 more kickoffs returned last year than the second most team. They had nearly 400 more total yards in return yards allowed last year than any other team in the NFL. 400 more yards than the team that finished in second. So ultimately, how is this going to impact the Green Bay Packers? The new rules might not impact them a ton, or at the very least, as much as it's going to impact other teams. Is that going to wind up being beneficial? Maybe not, because the Packers don't seem great at always stopping these kickoffs that occur. But nonetheless, it is something that they should be accustomed to. Which does kind of take us to question 2. How ultimately do you improve the special teams? What is Rich Bisaccia going to do? Because I've been talking about it a lot recently, because it just doesn't seem to be. We've talked about how other deficits of the team may be improving, from schematic changes, personnel changes. Look at Xavier McKinney showing up to play safety. Like, things are going to be different at that spot. But special teams, not a lot may be that different. Rich Bisaccia is back. Personnel is, predominantly going to be the same. But it's not every realm of special teams that truly needs to improve. Because Dan Whelan last year, the Irishman, he was pretty darn good, actually, for a first-year punter. He was 4th in the NFL in overall hang time. Most of his metrics put him in the top 3rd of the NFL in terms of quality of punts. Keyshawn Nixon, that guy, he led the league in kick return yards by over 700 yards last year. He also did happen to have more returns than anyone else, but dude was, he gets the accolades as a returner for a reason. But there is also questions remaining, such as who's going to be the punt returner? Because Keyshawn Nixon had 14 of them last year. Jaden Reed had 14 of them last year. So are they going to stay in this rotating alternative? Like, it depends what Jaden Reed just did on offense. It just depends what Keyshawn Nixon just did on defense. Who ultimately is going to win the job? And are they actually going to become an impact player? Or are both of them just going to continue to be spot holders that are going to be asked not to screw it up? Which is kind of what they were asked to do more often than not last year. It should be noted, for what it's worth, Reed actually had about 1 more yard per return than Keyshawn Nixon. Nixon has never really looked that comfortable as a punt returner. His area of expertise certainly is as a kick returner. But overall, like, step outside returning, right? Because Nixon's pretty good kick returning. Whelan's pretty good at punting. Obviously, you got to hope that the kicking game is going to be better from Carlson or be it Joseph. But are they truly banking on just better secondary depth that can lead to better tackling? That they have a more youthful roster that may be doing some special teams? Maybe they'll have starters play more snaps? What I'm saying here is, to this juncture, and granted, special teams is not a huge portion of OTAs or anything like that, but to this juncture, we have not heard Rich Bisaccia or really anyone on the Packers talk about, hey, our special teams sucked again last year. Here's what we're thinking we're going to do this year to actually make it better. I'm fearful that in spite of the big name Bisaccia now being there, that we still are not going to hear about renovations occurring on that area of the field, or I should say, like, that pseudo side of the ball. So it's ultimately concerning. We just kind of have to hope it's going to get addressed somehow. Question number 3 does have in part to do with Devontae Wyatt. You'll hear why in just a second. But ultimately, is Hafley's change for the defensive line? I'm not talking the full-blown scheme. We just don't know enough there yet. We can look at indications, sure. But one thing specifically we do know is he is asking the defensive lineman to change from this kind of read and react system to now much more crashing, hunting, going and get the running back for themselves. Is that really going to be beneficial for the run defense? Because ultimately, It just hasn't gotten any better. Last year, they were 28th in the NFL in giving up 127.1 yards per game on the ground every single game. Now, that also, they were 26th in the NFL in most attempts against in terms of rushing. So the two did kind of coincide, but also logically, like if a team can just run the ball at will against you, they're going to run the ball a lot against you, and that's exactly what we saw against the Green Bay Packers. So the question here is Hafley's change going to truly improve that? If it doesn't, Brian Gutekunst and company realistically have got to look at the personnel side of things and just seriously evaluate how they bring in defenders, specifically defensive linemen. Ultimately, though, for the defense last year, there were 146 missed tackles in the regular season, 21 in the postseason alone, and then to narrow that scope even more, 15 missed tackles against the San Francisco 49ers last year. You want an ingredient? I know they were in control of that game for 58 minutes, but you really want a main ingredient to getting ousted from the playoffs? You really want a good way to lose? Miss 15 tackles. It's a good way to do it. The reason why I put Devonte Wyatt on the screen for this talk is Devonte Wyatt happened to lead the Packers in missed tackles last year. He has to start finishing. But the overall question here is Hafley going to make it all improve for the defensive line? Can the Packers become at least an average team at stopping the run? One guy who actually was pretty good in that regard last year, at least in terms of the tackling department, was Quay Walker. And the real question here is he going to take a step forward? That's our question number 4. Frankly, he needs to. And this is just kind of a broad base, like, is he going to do it? Because ultimately from PFF last year, he had a 58.5 defensive grade. He had 7.6 as his tackling, or I should say like 7.6 was his missed tackle rate. One of the better ones on the team. He was a tackling machine. He works in the exact opposite direction of so many of them. But he also is one of the worst coverage linebackers in the NFL last year. I talked about that in terms of Packers that need to step up from that video just a few weeks ago. Quay Walker, now it seems as though, with Matt LaFleur saying it seems to be leaning that way, that Quay Walker is going to be getting the green dot, handling the communications for this new defense. Is he going to take the step up required? Is he all of a sudden going to start excelling in coverage? Is he going to become a playmaker beyond just being a reliable tackler? Because even just being a reliable tackler, great. We haven't always had those at linebacker. But something a little bit more would probably be good to have. Question number 5. Relevant, completely other side of the ball. And yet something that the Packers, another thing that they need to be taking a look at this offseason. Will fumbling improve? The Packers ultimately last year were 19th in the NFL with 1.3 fumbles per game. But they were only 8th in the NFL in 0.4 fumbles lost per game. We know that fumbles happen to be one of the flukiest things on a field. The fact that it's not always as simple as the team that fumbles the most is the team that loses the most. Sometimes the team that loses the most happen to not fumble very much at all. And you see that correlation here, 19th in fumbling, while only being 8th in fumbles lost. The good thing, like the thing you can do to solve it is just stop fumbling. Well, the Packers have a couple chronic high fumblers. And they didn't really get a lot better in that direction this offseason by adding Marshawn Lloyd and Josh Jacobs. Jordan Love led the team last year per PFF's tracking with 11 fumbles last year. Dontavian Wicks, he had 3. Well, they added Marshawn Lloyd, who had 3 in college last year and does have a bit of a reputation as a guy who puts the ball on the ground too much, kind of like Aaron Jones was for Green Bay. Okay, but then also Josh Jacobs last year, for his part, he had 3 fumbles last year for the Las Vegas Raiders. You put just those 4 dudes together. Take out any fluky one-offs from any other guys. You take just those 4 together. And maybe Wicks's were more fluky in nature, but nonetheless, they still were 3, and that's not good for a rookie receiver. So still, put them all together, and you nearly get last year's average in terms of fumbles per game just from those 4 dudes. So it's something that I'm sure has not been talked about, but it is something that I'm very confident is on Matt LaFleur's radar, and something that ultimately maybe should be talked about a little bit more, something that should be emphasized from a personnel department, something that's got to get looked at, because the Packers have got to stop putting the ball on the ground. Now, speaking of running backs, let's talk about the new one right there, Josh Jacobs. See, because the real question here, question 6, is how different is the run game going to look? I'm not necessarily worried about the pass game. I think we saw in the last half of the year the passing attack in its full fruition. I think we saw exactly what Matt LaFleur wants to do, and it worked. How about the run game, though? Because I'm not sure we've ever really seen, in spite of how good it's been during its peak, I'm not sure we've ever really seen exactly what the Packers want to do. And who they signed here may be kind of indicative. Last year, Aaron Jones had 182 attempts running the ball. 65% of those carries, or 119, were identified as zone runs. That's drastically higher than Josh Jacobs has done in the last couple of years. See, last year, Josh Jacobs had 233 rushing attempts, 106 of which can be called zone, only 46%. But dial it back a year, go back to 2022, which most people consider to be Josh Jacobs' best year in the NFL. And it's not particularly close. His rookie season was great. He's had some good years. But 2022, Josh Jacobs truly entered the conversation as one of the best running backs in the NFL. Let's take a look at how he divided his runs, or how the Raiders did that year. Well, he had 339 rush attempts that year, and measly 93 were zone runs. The vast majority were gap. Only 27% of his carries in 2022 were zone runs. So you have Jones last year doing 65% of zone runs. But then last year, Jacobs, the Raiders, only 46%. Year prior, when he was really, really good, 27%. Are the Packers aiming to get to more gap running, less zone? Are they going to abandon the zone approach? Or are they going to ask Jacobs to just run more zone because they think he can do it? We're going to find out. But something here is going to change. Something is going to go against tendency. Is it going to be the Packers, or is it going to be Jacobs? That one for sure we'll find out. As for question 7, we're going to take a look at the rookie. What if Jordan Morgan continues to struggle? Because we've heard in camp, granted, now I'm not looking to overblow this. He was a rookie in his first camp, and he's being learned to ask 4 positions, regularly playing 3 of them. If the dude didn't struggle, it also would be a headline. But let's just be honest. In mini camps, we heard several reports about Jordan Morgan getting beat, him struggling. Now, not amazing. It wasn't the top headline, but nonetheless, they were there. So let's talk about it. If he continues to struggle, if he just can't kind of get his footing here for his rookie year, which again does not make him a bust, it does not make it a wasted pick, it just means it's a rookie offensive lineman struggling, and those are not at all uncommon. So what if he does? What does that mean for the Packers' best 5 if Jordan Morgan can't be one of them? Does it lock Sean Ryan into a guaranteed starting job? Because that's not something he earned last year. He's still alternating with John Runyan Jr., who now signed a big deal with the Giants. Does it mean, in order to get more experience on the interior, does it mean that Royce Newman keeps his job with his $3 million cap hit, but also significantly more starting experience than really any other backup on the team, regardless of position on the offensive line? Regardless of most positions for this uber young team, actually. So what are the consequences if Jordan Morgan continues to struggle? Ideally, he's going to be one of the best 5, and they just got to figure out the shuffle. In my mind, ideally, he's your day 1 starting right guard, and you keep the tackles as they are. You got Elton Jenkins left guard, keep Myers at center, because it looks like they're going to do that anyway. But like that's your best 5. That's the ideal scenario here. But if he's not, what does that look like? And does it mean ultimately, if Sean Ryan doesn't step forward, if Jordan Morgan isn't an improvement, and they don't have John Runyan Jr. there at right guard, does it mean that the offensive line might be setting themselves up to take a step back? Seems to be an awful lot riding on a rookie. And I don't mean to be overly dramatic or anything like that. I'm just saying, what if? As for question 8, are the hamstrings truly fixed? It's a pretty worthwhile question considering the injuries with Christian Watson and Eric Stokes and just all the soft tissue things. And then a sub question here is, are the changes that new strength and conditioning coordinator Aaron Hill, are they truly making a difference? Are they going to make a difference over the span of a season? Because if you look over the last couple of years, the Packers are not one of the most injured teams in the NFL. They're really not. They're kind of middle in the pack in terms of like games lost for starters being injured. But the injuries that the Packers have suffered have been frustrating, have been chronic, have been so many questions for us on the fan side of things. Look at the David Bakhtiari situation, right? Or even their injuries that are fairly large, a la Rashawn Gary, Elton Jenkins a couple years ago. Not just the kind that you miss a couple games. The Packers have got those too. Aaron Jones last year. Or even Jair Alexander, right? So it's not just that the injury is occurring. It's who they're occurring to. It's the fashion of the injury. It's whether they're, simple, clean things that a guy can just recover from, or are they the kind that just seem to crop up continually? And does Aaron Hill have the fix? Is him having big guys and little guys doing different exercises? Is he having rookies and vets splitting up to do exercises? Is he having different positions do different things? Is all of this actually going to take an effect? More stretching, as we've heard about. Is it going to take effect? Is it going to help some of the biggest name players stay healthy? Is it going for Watson and Stokes? Is it going to mean prosperous health beyond just the balancing of hamstrings being stronger one versus the other? Of course, new data helps. But what's Aaron Hill's role in this? And is it truly going to improve? That one we absolutely positively can't know yet. But we can hope for the best. Next one. Question 9. Who wins the biggest battles? Because there are some big camp battles. Of course, Sean Clifford there being involved in one himself for quarterback too. But also the rotation on the defensive line going to be massively important. The rotation at wide receiver and tight end going to be very, very important. Not necessarily declaring starters there because frankly, who really cares? They're all going to see the field. But more so, what's the rotation going to be? But then one truly starting position that seemingly is up for grabs. Carrington Valentine versus Eric Stokes for cornerback 2. We've heard LaFleur wax poetic about Stokes and Valentine in different ways this offseason. But it is maybe the position that most is going to be determined by what we see day in and day out at training camp. Who's going to win could help determine the season. Oh, and by the way, I know we talked about him at the top, but like kicker, very much in the conversation here as to who's going to get that job. And then number 10. Number 10. How much Super Bowl merch is there going to be and how expensive it's going to be? Because I don't have a lot. That's the real question. Because in spite of all of these questions, the Packers, as I said on Wednesday, should absolutely find themselves amongst the top teams in the NFC. In spite of some, I think it was ESPN put out some overall team ranking. I don't know. I didn't read it. I don't really care that much. I just saw the headlines about it because really, it's just off-season fodder. But like the Packers were ranked like having as the 13th best roster in the NFL. They might be a little bit better than that, but nonetheless, the Packers should find themselves amongst one of the top teams in the NFC. They should find themselves in a position much like they did last year. As I explained on Wednesday at the live, if you caught that, maybe we don't expect a 21 touchdown, 3 interception half season from Jordan Love, right? A 42-6 ratio seems a bit much to ask if you put it over the whole season. Maybe we don't expect the success, the peak of how well they played against Dallas. Maybe we don't expect that week in and week out. But it is known now what the Packers can look like and what stratosphere at least they should be in regularly, even if it's not what they look like week in and week out. Even that stratosphere, if that's the norm, this is a team that should achieve great things. So we'll find out. And I got to tell you, I can't wait. Hope everyone out there has an absolutely fantastic week next week. Remember, no new programming coming out from me next week. But the week after, we hit the ground running, talking about the Super Bowl, diving into specifics as to why this Packer team should be considered a contender. And then the inverse of maybe like, why not? But we're going to be talking about that. Lives will return the week after as well. And then it's training camp mode. Here's facts about every single dude. That's a week-long series. And then camp itself. It's time to get going. Hope everyone out there has an absolutely fantastic week next week. Hope you truly enjoy the 4th of July. As I say with every single holiday, I hope it's whatever you need it to be. And I just leave it at that. Thanks everybody for joining me here at Lombardi Time Brews. Have a great week. And as always, go Pack Go.